affairs. Facts and opinion. Their future in our hands. Markets. Globalist technocrats versus the people. A line in the sand. The McIntyre Report.
Welcome, folks, to the McIntyre Report. Jamie McIntyre here on behalf of the Australian National Review. Let's talk about some things that I find very interesting in our society. See, we've all grown up in Australia and most Western nations thinking that we live in a democracy and we must defend Western values very strongly. Like, you listen to the likes of Sky News presenters such as Andrew Bolt, who strongly stands up for Western values. And there's nothing wrong with that if the West actually had any values left, that is. The Western values these days could be transgenderism, the loony left taking over the world, where the important issues must be the climate change fraud and diversity and equity, all these buzzwords pushed by their oligarch masters, manipulated influence, but they're not really focusing on what's important. So what I was thinking about even last night before preparing for this show was, how come is it that if we don't live in a democracy, for anyone wanting to suggest that in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Japan, Western Europe, England, America, we live in a democracy, well, that obviously means that Joe Biden is our supreme leader. He is the leader and the mastermind behind all the policies and what's going on in the world and the direction it's heading. And people like Anthony Albanese and New Zealand Prime Minister and England, etc., are just puppets of Joe Biden. Now, it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you know that's nonsense. Joe Biden can't even ride a bicycle. Joe Biden forgets who his wife is. The same Joe Biden that showers with his daughter, or did, is known as Peter the Pedo by his own family. That Joe Biden that can't even read the scripts that someone else writes for him, let alone write a script, is clearly not in charge. He's not even in charge of his mental facilities and pretty much in charge of his basement. That's about it. And they occasionally let him out to make a mess of things. So knowing that, we have to accept then that who is running the show? If Joe Biden is a puppet, then who is the master? And I've talked about this before, but it's like, isn't it interesting? Putin talks about the Western elites. That's the word he used, elites. We could refer to them as oligarchs or billionaire elites. Globalists is another word for them. But why aren't they talked about? Now, you hear some of the front people, George Soros, you hear a lot about. Tucker Carlson is really attacking him as well. I mean, George Soros, we know, is behind the illegal armed coup of Ukraine in 2014, working with the US State Department. George Soros is worth about $35 billion, a billionaire that, he started his career dobbing the Jews in, despite being Jews, into the Nazis in Germany. And he'll probably finish his career working with the Nazis in Ukraine that he's helped fund. He runs a foundation called Open Society, which usually the words they say mean the opposite, closed society and destruction of Western society. He's out to destroy America, and he rigged the election, whether you like that or not, the last election, and probably the one before that, but particularly the last one in the United States of America. He has motive. He has the ability to do that, but he has done it around the world and rigged currencies as a result, and that's how he's made his fortune. So he's obviously a powerful oligarch elite, billionaire elite. He's a globalist as well. He doesn't want he doesn't like Trump, detests Trump, and considers Trump to be a destroyer of democracy, which is quite ironic because the left-leaning, loony left Democrats under Biden, who Biden is the puppet for George Soros, is all about destroying what's left of American democracy. But is he the only one? Of course, there's the Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, and another with $140 billion, up $20 billion he's made during the COVID pandemic. Those vaccines have been very effective at boosting his bank account, certainly not very effective at boosting people's immune system. And there is others, but how come we're never allowed to mention the two biggest, richest families in the West that really are more influential and have been than George Soros, Klaus Schwab, and others? And they both have their names, these families start with R. Now, you can guess one of them, probably, or two of them. Their names start with R, but you never hear them hardly ever mentioned in Western media. I wonder why. The most powerful families on the planet that combined have over $1 trillion net worth known about. It's probably a lot more than that. That have had power for some of them for over 100 years, some families for several hundred years, but were never mentioned in the Western media. Could that be something to do with the fact they own most of Western media and they don't like themselves to be identified? They like to remain anonymous, behind the scenes, pulling the strings, being the puppet masters. So, of course, I'm talking about you know who. The Rockefellers and Rothschilds, two very powerful families. Now, are we to believe that there's a group of people, if we live in an oligarchy, not a democracy, that the group of people that are pulling the strings are a bunch of poor people that got together and infiltrated our cabinets, infiltrated and were able to buy out our politicians and our media and our largest, control over our intelligence agencies, own the military-industrial complex and the medical pharmaceutical cartel? Are we saying a bunch of poor people did that? No, of course not. So it's going to be a bunch of rich people. So wouldn't the prime suspects be some of the richest people on the planet? Is there any other people richer? There's not many people richer, and I suggest to you, than the Rothschilds and Rockefeller families. Now, of course, you don't hear about them, or do you? You actually do hear about them, but they don't mention their name. Have you heard of the Federal Reserve banking system? Every time they mention the Fed or the Federal Reserve, they're actually talking about the Rothschilds, but the Rothschilds don't like their name to be mentioned, because if enough people were to realize the real enemies of the world are a few elite, very wealthy trillionaire families, effectively, then we'd stop fighting amongst each other. We'd stop being left and right and who's wrong, and stop allowing countries like Ukraine to be divided into civil war with Western Ukrainians against Eastern Ukrainians and then against Russia, when they're all quite similar. Many of them are the same. We wouldn't allow ourselves to be divided like in World War I, World War II. These elite families ensured that Germany was at war with Russia and also England. The same thing we see right now, and we'll talk about that. Let's just have a look at that right now. Some leaked documents have come out and highlighting that, but let's take a look at this. These are leaked documents from the RAND Corporation, and this newly leaked report from RAND Corporation reveals the true motives behind European destabilization in the Russian-Ukraine war. So what it means is that these elites manipulate things behind the scenes. So you've heard of them before. Anytime they mention, as I said, the Federal Reserve Bank, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, you might have heard of these. These are all non-government organizations that you and I didn't get to vote for. But when they're mentioning these, they are mentioning the Rothschilds, because the Rothschilds set most of these up and control most of these. United Nations, you may have heard as well. And then what about the Rockefellers? Have you heard of the World Health Organization, CDC? The World Economic Forum, headed by Klaus Schwab. These are all mentioning, effectively without saying the name Rockefeller, are saying it. You leak documents of the Rockefeller Institute as how we know and been able to accurately predict what was happening with the pandemic, that it's a falsified pandemic, that the COVID climate change is also a falsified climate crisis. Not that we aren't damaging the environment, but the climate change scam is not going to help the environment. It's a form of ushering in globalism, central control, one world government, which used to just be considered a conspiracy theory. But notice all the so-called conspiracy theories are coming from the Rothschilds and Rockefeller-owned media, saying as soon as we start to discover the truth, no, that's just a conspiracy theory. Some people think the Rothschilds is a conspiracy theory. They exist. They're not a fantasy. I wrote about it in my first book, 1999, What I Didn't Learn at School But Wish I Had, which you can download, by the way, free of charge. Just to go to our Australian National Review, anrnews.com, and opt your email in there, and you'll be able to download that book free of charge. But back in 1999, I talked about the fraud of the Federal Reserve banking system, the history of the Rothschilds, and the history over our money. Whoever issues money controls our world. But unfortunately, the Rothschilds and Rockefellers are losing their control. Why? Because instead of them pushing the Great Reset, what has caused the pushback, and it's caused the Great Awakening. And many people, like you and I and others, have suddenly come out of our slumber. September 11th was probably the first thing that started that. Before that, or after that, the Iraq War, those supposed weapons of mass destruction that never actually existed. And we started to slowly wake up, but the COVID fraud woke up most people. You see, most of us sitting and going about minding our own business say, well, I'm too busy with my job. I just don't want to get caught up in all this stuff. I just don't understand it. In the past, you could get away with that because we've lived in reasonably peaceful times in the West, particularly in Australia. We can just mind our own business, go about our own life, and who cares if there's a secret elite bunch of families that are trying to rule the world and dictate where it's heading and how we live our lives. We wouldn't care. They just left us alone. But then something changed. The falsified COVID pandemic, when they wanted to make sure each and every one of us had to be locked down, had to wear a mask, had to close down businesses, had to stay at home, couldn't go more than 5 kilometers from our house, couldn't cross our state borders and see our loved ones, and then had to take experimental phase 3 jab to enter the pub or restaurants or participate in society or keep our jobs. That's when they overstepped the line. They crossed that line in the sand where these powerful families with their agendas do influence you. Notice how all the governments around the world following the same script. Notice how majority of the world's mainstream media all push and say the same things. Because it's all coming from the same sources. Zelensky in Ukraine answers to the same oligarchs as Biden does in the United States. And by indirect, Anthony Albanese in Australia is a globalist shill. He doesn't answer to the people. If he was answering to the people in true democracy, he wouldn't have been elected. Only 3 out of 10 people, probably the 3 out of 10 that would vote for Biden, the loony left, nutcase people that really been the most indoctrinated and fooled and misled, voted for Anthony Albanese. Only 3 out of 10. 7 out of 10 rejected him. He has no mandate. But so-called democracy. Is he answering to the people? He has no mandate for climate change, nonsense. The majority of people don't want them. The majority of people are starting to wake up and see through that nonsense. Now, we'll be back with some more, but some thoughts to think about. How come we don't hear about the Rothschilds and Rockefellers every day, considering they had the most influence over the West? Well, we actually do, because we hear about as I said, the Federal Reserve, the massive power it has over our lives and interest rates that go up. The World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, which become effectively the one world government and is wanting to become the one world government. Once again, overriding national sovereignty. These globalists don't like national sovereignty. They don't like nationalist leaders like a Putin. He's a nationalist leader. They don't like a Trump because he's a nationalist. Make America great again. Is let's make America great. A strong America would be great for the world, but not according to these being the elites, and that's the challenge that we have. So let's go to a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment with some more.